I'm Mel Clarke. Only my mum calls me Melanie. I think actually says Mel. I work for Highways England. I've been there for getting on 14 years. I used to work with Jodie back in the day. I'm a new member, a relatively new member to CIHT. Although I have worked with CIHT in a variety of different things, usually on the women's agenda, because I run the Leading Women's Network for Highways England, and I've done that for the last 4 or so years. And it was really interesting listening to these conversations. First of all, it's fantastic to be here. As I've just mentioned, I've worked with CIHT around the women's issue, and I really am very supportive of the work that they do in this space. Indeed, Sue came and presented at one of my Leading Women's events, which is fantastic, and I hope we are part of the reason why the membership has gone up a little bit for women in CIHT, because I know we were promoting it actively there. The three sort of objectives for my Leading Women's group really resonates with some things that we heard earlier, which is actually really providing role models across Highways England and across the wider industry for women in our organisation. So women that they can aspire to and kind of understand the journeys that those women have taken. Also, an important thing about networking and confidence and developing that confidence in the right ways in order to help women progress their careers within our organisation in particular. But most importantly, to create that ask back into the business, to do the right things for the women in our organisation, to create the right conditions, to have the right policies and procedures and the things that Jodie was talking about too in her session. So what I've been asked to speak about is a bit broader than that. I was kind of left with the last bit really, which is what about the future of women's rights, and is more legislation needed? So at a global level, there is so much more to do. I was listening to the radio this morning with two ladies from Afghanistan on the radio, and they live in a different world to us. Access to education is a relatively new thing in Afghanistan. We take so many things for granted, but there are laws and policies in place in other parts of the world, from abortion laws to sexual rights, to access to education, to freedom from violence, that are so beyond our understanding of our world today. So sadly, it may take many more decades for the world to be right in this place, and we are all responsible for being part of that journey and actually supporting those things that go on beyond our own world. So some believe it will take us 100 years to get and beyond to get to a right place in the world. Close to home, of course, women's rights have advanced. This year's the 100th centenary of the suffrage movement. Some of you maybe have been involved in some suffrage events. I certainly have been. It's really fantastic to celebrate that. We wouldn't enjoy the freedoms that we enjoy today had those women not made those sacrifices. Again, those ladies from Afghanistan on the radio today were passionately talking about being willing to make the sacrifices that the suffrage movement made 100 years ago to create a better world for women in their part of the world in the future. So there are women in the world today making those sacrifices that we enjoy the freedoms of because of women that made the sacrifices in our past. And we take those for granted, but we shouldn't, okay? Because we're not all right. The world isn't still a perfect place globally. And actually, even on our own doorstep, there is still more to do. So, from the Me Too campaign mentioned earlier and the President's Club scandal to more recent stories in the press. Philip Green, Google, okay? Google's latest sacking of 48 members of staff for sexual harassment and bullying. On that last one, it's apparent that no matter how seriously a company takes that issue, and they have sacked 48 people, so that's taking it fairly seriously, there's a widespread problem. It relates to all industries. This is not unique to our industry. And actually, a lot of it goes on for a long time before it comes bubbling to the surface. So actually, the real challenge about understanding what doesn't go reported, what doesn't get mentioned, what doesn't get seen, until some brave person, usually a woman, kind of rings a bell and says, actually, enough's enough, and then actually it all starts to come to a head. Following a 6-month inquiry, the Women and Equalities Committee stated that the government, regulators and employers are failing in their responsibilities to tackle sexual harassment in the workplace. They published their report earlier this year and they set out 5 key priorities. So introduce a new duty on employees to prevent harassment, supporting a statutory code of practice outlining the steps they can take to do that. require regulators to take a more active role, setting out the actions they will help to tackle this problem and the enforcement action that will be taken. Make the enforcement processes work better for employees by setting out a statutory code of practice that employers should do to tackle sexual harassment. Clean up the use of non-disclosure agreements. So I'm sure we've heard quite a bit in the press about non-disclosure agreements, including requiring the use of standard plain English language and confidentiality clauses, so women and anybody really understands what they're signing up to when they sign an NDA. And collect robust data on the extent of sexual harassment in the workplace and the number of employee tribunal claims, complaints involving harassment of a sexual nature. So that's one area where we have to recognise that this is still happening. It's fairly widespread. The Corn Ferry Institute published a report last year, which I read, and it was a really interesting report. If you can get your hands on it, I'd recommend it, called Women CEOs Speak, to try and understand what drives the 6%, only 6% of CEOs of the Fortune 1000 CEOs. Okay, so they interviewed 57 women out of 1,000 CEOs. So that is actually quite an astonishing lack of women at that level across many, many businesses. So the report's concluded, and it resonates again with things that some of my colleagues here were saying earlier, that there's still organisations are still presenting layers of difficulty for women, okay, either through unconscious bias. Actually, we're not deliberately kind of putting these things in the way, but actually the processes that we have, the policies that we have, and our behaviours and attitudes are unconscious, they're ingrained in us, and actually they make us make choices. But also around transparency about leadership potential. What is required in terms of leadership potential? The things about the softer skills, the different skills, the mix of skills, the harder skills, and the mix of those, and creating a transparency around understanding what those skills are that take a woman from high potential to actually being the CEO of a Fortune 1000 company. And then not framing leadership roles in a way that's appealing to women, so actually setting out the job descriptions or the roles or the activities that will undertake in a way that says, actually, as a woman, I'd quite like to do that job. That job sounds like an interesting job for a woman to do. And then actually not being creative around time mitigation and mobility demands to make those opportunities more inclusive. And I actually think that's irrespective of gender, because I actually think as men and women start to blend their shared responsibilities around things like childcare, for example. My husband's a stay-at-home dad, as it happens. Actually, it's important that you have that, you balance and mitigate that work-life balance opportunities for all of your employees. So the Corn Ferry Institute, that research is really interesting. I would recommend you read it, because actually the challenge is still only 6% of women make it to that level in our top 1,000 companies. And then finally, pay. We've mentioned pay a lot. So the BBC pay scandal, we're all aware of that. And absolutely, one woman really fought for the rights of other women in that organisation. It actually changed the agenda there, didn't it? So the law does need to be strengthened so that women can exercise their right to equal pay. Last year, any organisation with 250 plus employees have to publish, or have had to publish and report very specific details about their gender pay gap. Okay, and there's lots of government support. If you go online, you can get support and advice on how to close the gap. But of course, there's no legislation that says that you have to do it by a certain date. You have to make the pay equal. So actually, could we go further? According to statistics agency Eurostat, the UK has the 6th largest gender pay gap in the EU. And put simply, for every pound a man in Britain earns, on average, a woman will still only receive 80%, which in real terms means we work for free 57 days each year. So, change to legislation that have happened so far is important, but I would leave you with the question, does it go far enough? Thank you.